Hello, I am Commissioner Emma I. Darnell. Welcome to Mighty Five Conversations. Conversation is a monthly information and communication program focusing on the sustainable community, economically strong, environmentally safe, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you for joining us. I will be back in a moment. Joining me in the conversation today is Mrs. Phyllis Bailey, a retired teacher and historian. Ms. Bailey is a graduate of Howard University and the University of Virginia. She is an extremely active volunteer in District 5 and in her own community in District 7. She's also a member of the Board of Directors of the Friends of Harriet G. Darnell Senior Facility, Incorporated. Welcome, Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for having me.
Well, we're just so happy to have you. During Older Americans Month on Senior University Day, you presented a multimedia, what I call history lesson about the struggle in this country for the voting rights
Yes.
of Black Americans and indeed all minorities. And of course, we know that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been called one of the most successful
Yes.
pieces of legislation ever adopted by the United States Congress. And of course, we know the law is still the law. Section 2 of the Act makes it unlawful to discriminate against persons at the polls with respect to voting because of race.
Yes.
And notwithstanding all of the current discussion about the
Indeed.
Supreme Court's decision in interpreting Section 4 of the Act, that law is unchanged.
Yes.
Section 2 is unchanged. But when I listened to your presentation, when all of us listened to your presentation during May at Old America's Month, at the end of it, a lady said to me, you know, Emma, maybe we ought not call that the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Maybe we ought to call that the Voting Rights Act of 1865. And I'm sure you will agree, Ms. Bailey,
Yes.
she got the point, didn't she?
Yes, she did.
That's what we want to talk about today, Ms. Bailey. We want to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1865, what that means.
1865 is important because that was, of course, the end of the Civil War. And at that time, the 13th Amendment was passed to give freedom to all of those who had been enslaved previously. According to history, the 1865 Act did not actually grant the rights that the previously enslaved persons had expected because there was resistance. Just as there is resistance today to any kind of action by the legislature or lawmakers to make voting more accessible to all, there was this resistance at that time. Consequently, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, and that, of course, gave citizenship to all residents, native-born, and those who had been made citizens. They gave them the right to vote. Well, the persons in the defeated area decided that if they were given federal citizenship, that didn't give them state citizenship. Always a device, as you see, to try to restrict the voting rights. And so in 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed. That amendment granted the right to vote to all male citizens of the United States, federally and statewide. Well, that in itself has caused a number of problems. And even today, the Voting Rights Act that we're talking about for 1965, the actual title is the Voting Rights Act to enforce the 15th Amendment.
What does that mean?
It means that the 15th Amendment has never truly been enforced. And that's very sad for a country that proposes to be a leader in the rights of man. We're concerned about the rights of people all over the world, but we have a major problem right here at home.
But beginning with the effort to enforce the 15th Amendment during this period, what was the next step?
The first step, of course, was when Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, August 6, 1965. This had been preceded by Bloody Sunday, which had taken place in March. And of course, Congressman John Lewis stands as a monument, a testament to what happened at that point. The world saw what happened Bloody Sunday, when these people were beaten, were attacked. Really, war took place against these innocent folk who had no weapons. War by the police, their dogs, the batons, the clubs, the chains, whatever. At any rate, Lyndon Baines Johnson came on television just after that and expressed his view that all people deserve the right to vote, especially American citizens.
Had Black Americans had an opportunity to vote between the time of the adoption of the 15th Amendment in the period between 70 and 1965?
In that period, first of all, the Supreme Court had always ruled to uphold all the devices that had been instituted by the Southern states. Now, the Southern states, after the 15th Amendment was passed, you remember Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson became president.
Were these the laws that were enacted immediately following the Civil War?
Yes.
And the 14th Amendment, of course, guaranteed the equal protection of the laws
Absolutely.
to all. And the 15th Amendment
Gave the right to vote.
Gave the right to
to
vote.
all male citizens.
Does that mean then that black men were able to vote?
They should have been, according to the law.
But it didn't happen.
It didn't happen. The Southern states under Andrew Johnson were virtually given a hands-off kind of situation. Andrew Johnson withdrew all of the federal troops from the South.
Who was president? Andrew Johnson.
He took the presidency after Lincoln was assassinated. He removed the troops from the South. So therefore, it was a carte blanche to all previous Southern leaders to make sure that the African Americans remained in the same status that they had been as slaves.
Is this that period they call the Reconstruction period?
It was supposedly the Reconstruction. You've had several periods that have been called that, but this was the first one.
This was the first one.
Yes.
And I believe there were blacks who were elected to the United States
Absolutely.
Congress. They were blacks that were elected to state legislatures all during that period. But then President Johnson removed the troops.
And Southern states began their march toward reversing all that had been done.
What were some of the actions that were taken?
The first was in Mississippi when they revised the Constitution of the state to reflect that one would have to have certain qualities to vote. You had to have property, you had to have a certain educational level, and to make sure that all of the Caucasians who did not possess those kinds of qualities, they instituted the grandfather clause. That said that if your grandfather voted before 1877, then you could vote, and you didn't have to have any of
That
the
pretty much excluded
all blacks.
all blacks because before that period, blacks were slaves,
That's right.
and according to the Supreme Court, had no rights.
Absolutely. They made that clear in Dred
Yes.
Scott.
I see. And what were those literacy tests?
The literacy test was a situation wherein a white person who would be the registrar would present something, could be the Constitution or something they couldn't even read. They would present it to the black applicant, and they were supposed to read it and interpret it. And they were then left with the decision as to whether or not that person actually interpreted correctly.
And these were some of the requirements that the southern states developed
These were some of the devices.
that were needed if black Americans were to vote.
Yes. And then, of course, there was the white primaries, wherein they would get together in small groups and decide who was going to be on the ballot. And they put people on the ballot that they wanted. So if a person got to vote, they had very little in the way of choice because the people who were actually on the ballot had been predetermined by a group who made sure that they were not going to give rights to any black American.
Bill, we're going to pause now for a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the other kinds of experiences of black Americans who were attempting to exercise the rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendment even before Selma.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll be right back. Ms. Bailey, you were setting out for us the road between the 14th Amendment and the so-called Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I understand you to say that that road was characterized by many actions by the southern states to prevent black Americans from voting, even though the law was adopted when the 14th and 15th Amendment were adopted. In fact, you said the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was really called the bill to enforce because for over 100 years it really had not been enforced.
That's true. Many of the southern states instituted, well, participated in, I should say, lynchings, intimidations, burning of homes, destruction of churches, and we can look at Birmingham, 16th Street Baptist Church as an example.
For this
of
modern
that.
period.
Yes.
It came on down.
It came on down,
yes.
and it was something that intimidated people to the point that they were afraid to even stay in their homes. The Ku Klux Klan came into being, and they would ride through neighborhoods. People hid in their homes, turned out all lights to try to make sure that they didn't attract any attention. Families didn't want their young people particularly to do anything that would cause a white person to be upset because the Klan might visit them. There were poll taxes. And it was interesting that the poll tax was a tax that was instituted and due in May of each year. And this was done particularly because African Americans were farmers at that time. And the only time that a farmer had money was when the crops were harvested, which would have been in the autumn, September, that general period. So if you could not pay your poll tax in May, you could not vote in the November election. So that was done specifically to make sure they couldn't vote. Other things were like moving a polling place. In one county, well, even today they've done such things. They will have the polling place on a street where blacks who did not have cars could possibly walk to, could possibly get to very easily. So in order to dilute that vote, you move the polling place out on the main highway, maybe 10, 12 miles from town, so that the only people who could get out there would be those who had cars. These were the kinds of things. People were afraid they would lose their jobs. The sharecropping system was in place, wherein a person worked on somebody else's land, and half of their crops, or any amount that the owner chose to solicit, would have to be given to the owner. And the only way they could get food, clothing, and other materials to live would to be buy from the company store, the store that was established on the plantation. And of course, at the end of the year, they always owed more than they could possibly produce. And since they were unable to read, they could not determine whether or not they were being overcharged or not. So consequently, they were always in debt to this person. So they would have to go back and work some more to try to pay off this debt, which at the end of the next year amounted to the same thing.
And therefore, voting,
Voting was out.
was out.
Oh, yes.
It was not an option.
No, not at all.
So here we are in
Here-
Selma.
Yes.
And what happened in Selma?
In Selma, it started out with some young people deciding that Selma was a central area wherein they could make an impact to get people to register to vote. And so they went to Selma, and this was the organization of young people, and most of them were jailed. And when Dr. Martin Luther King and the SCLC, I think it was, found out what was going on, they decided to go down and help them. And so they went down, and he decided on that day that they would have a march from Selma to the capital, Montgomery, and that they would start out on a Sunday morning. And they actually did. They started to march, a large group of people, and they came to the Edmund
It's a rather
Pettus.
diverse group too, wasn't it?
Very much so.
Yes,
Very much so.
From all over.
All
the
over,
country.
because people
black
had
and white.
Black and white. They
Yes.
had come in by busloads to be with them. And when they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the Atlanta police stood on the other side.
Alabama.
Alabama, I'm sorry, I'm saying Atlanta. Alabama State Police stood on the other side. And as they crossed the bridge and they reached them, they attacked them with water hoses, sticks, batons,
Horses.
everything. John Lewis, our representative, who is our hero, bears scars from that encounter today.
Yes, we had many local folks who were involved in that. Andrew
Yes.
Young, Hosea Williams, who was
Yes.
also on the bridge. And then, of course, when that march failed and the folks in this nation saw the brutality and the blood, America being America said no. And you told us what President Lyndon
Yes.
Johnson did in response to that.
It was something that the world saw, and Dr. King knew that if the media were involved, that the world would see what many in the South had been long trying to tell them that was
Yes.
going on. And the world did see.
So they had that second march and they went to
And
Montgomery.
they went to Montgomery. Yes, they did.
But they had to send troops, didn't they?
Yes, to protect
the National Guard to protect them in the march from Selma to Montgomery.
Montgomery.
And so President Lyndon Johnson made his famous "We Shall Overcome" speech to the Congress, and the laws, this
The
law,
law was
the Voting
passed.
Rights Act of 1965 was adopted. I think it might be helpful if you could tell us, Ms. Bailey, what that law really provided for Black Americans in this country and other minorities.
The Voting Rights Act says that federal oversight of elections in states that have a history of discriminatory voting preferences will be enforced. Section 2 of that law is permanent, cannot be changed.
Yes, because Section 4, which gave federal authorities oversight, was recently held to be unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court directed the Congress to look at the formula again that dealt with what states would be covered.
Well, you
But
know,
the story you've been telling us about is not about what states are going to be covered by preclearance. You've been telling us about a law that protects the rights of every American to vote irrespective of their race. And I believe that's Section 2, right?
yes, it is.
And the Supreme Court, didn't even
The Supreme
touch it.
Court didn't touch Section 2, and it didn't touch Section 5,
It
actually.
really did. It
They
really did.
addressed Section 4B, which is the formula by which you determine what Section 5 will do. Now, they claim that the formula is outdated because it was based on 1966, I believe, 66 or 67 figures.
Yes.
However, we're concerned because Section 5, as you said, Commissioner, is still in force.
Yes. Well, actually, what's going to have to happen is that the Congress, according to the Supreme Court, was directed to look at a formula that set aside southern states and a few other states to be covered by the preclearance requirement. But we want to focus on Section 2, which gives all citizens, irrespective of their race or ethnicity, the right to vote. And of course, this was not challenged the other day, and it remains the law yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Of course, as you indicated, Mrs. Bailey, we are disappointed that the Supreme Court was unable to see the impact of photo ID, redistricting laws that gerrymander, that lines that separate counties like Fulton into black and white. We're all disappointed. But when you put the history down about the adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendment and all of the barriers that were placed to prevent black Americans from voting, and we look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and look at that Section 2, we have to say thank you to all those, black and white, from the North and South, who made Section 2 possible.
And who gave their lives.
And who gave their lives for it. Thank you so much, Ms. Bailey,
so much for
this history lesson. And we want to forever remember that these kinds of privileges and rights that we enjoy did not fall from the sky.
No, they did not. And
Thank
we
you.
must continue to maintain them.
And we must protect them.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
and
Ms.
it has
Bailey.
been my pleasure.
I'll be back in a moment with closing thoughts. Margaret Walker has written, "Teach the words to the children and see that they do not forget them. Recite them in their going out and in their coming in." Thank you to Mrs. Bailey and to all of those who teach the words and the deeds on behalf of all the children of Fulton County. Until next time, stay strong. To learn more about today's conversation, contact me at 404-612-8222. That's 404-612-8222. You can also email me at emma.darnell@fultoncountyga.gov. www.census.gov.